Okay, welcome back. This is part two of the week 14 lecture. So, all we need to talk about here would be the poem, the prairies, and let's just cover child sort of briefly. So, I want to start with the prairies. This is a poem that I think is a great way to kind of wrap things up for the semester because it's really encapsulating a lot of the things that we've been talking about. And it's very much elegiac. It's sort of an elegy for the lost frontier to a certain extent. So we've talked about sort of this rapid progress and rapid westward expansion that really characterized the early decades of the 19th century. We saw last week that Irving is kind of commenting on some of that with The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. And even with Dolph Haliger, there's kind of this recurring idea of progress, old things being lost. And we're celebrating the old things that are lost, but we're also kind of feeling bad that they're gone. So that's, we're kind of operating in that register here in the prairies. Bryant, who's an Easterner, he's from Massachusetts, very similar to a lot of the authors we've read, like Sedgwick, like many others, like Child. She was from Massachusetts as well, I believe. So he's a New Englander who was inspired to write this poem after visiting his brother in Illinois at the beginning of the 1830s. So this is still kind of early on in the settlement of this particular part of the country because it had only come under U.S. jurisdiction at the beginning of the century. Previously, Illinois, the upper Midwest, had been controlled by the French at a certain point, by the British at a certain point, and it came under U.S. jurisdiction, I believe, through the Louisiana Purchase, or at least, well, I think Illinois had already fallen to us prior to that, late in the 18th century after the French Indian War, but we didn't settle a lot of this area for a long time. Again, Native Americans remained there through the end of the 1700s into the early 1800s, but by the 1820s and 1830s, Anglo-American settlement was really underway, kind of converting these broad, sweeping prairies and sort of grassland into farms and towns, a process that would continue, as we've talked about, really throughout the rest of the century. So Bryant goes out there, visits his brother, and he's really struck by the landscape. And he's also struck by this conception of Native American history that I think is interesting. It's not exactly accurate. It might put us a little bit in mind of Rowson and a little bit less in mind of Sedgwick, in the sense that Bryant is kind of celebrating Native American culture and history, but he's doing it in a way that we might consider to be a little bit backhanded, because he's kind of creating an alternate Native American history, a little bit akin to what we see from Rowson, which I think is weird, and we can kind of talk about it, but I just want to look at a few lines of the poem. Like I said, I linked you guys to this. So if you're looking at it, I'm looking at it here in an old anthology. But one thing that's interesting to note is the third line of this poem got changed after the original publication of the text. So when this poem was first published in 1834, the third line read as follows: "And fresh as the young earth, ere man had sinned." So, a reference to Adam and Eve and the Garden of Eden, and this was a familiar sort of trope at the time. A lot of writers compared the frontier to sort of pre-lapsarian Eden. This idea of, it's pure, it's like Eden before the fall. That was language that was used a lot because, again, to Anglo settlers, this was sort of untouched. It was virgin land. That was another common phrase. Again, we don't really think of it that way anymore. We're far more cognizant of the fact that Native Americans lived there, and there were cultures, there were histories that were getting effaced and removed and disrupted at the time. But the Anglo perspective that Bryant is capturing here, again, that sort of biblical language would have been common. But if you guys look at the version that I linked you to, you'll notice the third line no longer says that. It was changed in future editions. So you see the new version which is for which the speech of England has no name. So now the unshorn fields, boundless and beautiful, for which the speech of England has no name. This is a really important change, I think, to the text, because Bryant's doing two things. Number one, this is, again, part of, finding a national literature. How are we different than older literary traditions? Well, as we mentioned weeks ago, one of the things that made us distinct was our landscape, our geography. You don't find geography like it on the British Isles. You don't really find prairies on the British Isles. So this is something unique to the U.S. So yeah, Bryant's tapping into that, but he's also kind of quite literal about what he says here. And I have a footnote that tells me this. You guys don't need it, I guess, although it helps. He's alluding to the fact that the word prairie literally did not exist previously in the English language. It was adopted from the French. It was a term used by French explorers and trappers who were the first Europeans in what would later become Illinois, where by the 1830s, Bryant's brother lived. So not only are we distinct from England in terms of our landscape, our geography, but also the history of this place. It's not really an English colonial history. The French were here. This is not the seaboard. This is not old colonial America. This is not Bryant's home of Massachusetts, which has an old English colonial history. This is a different part of the country, and in the 1830s, what we now think of as the upper Midwest or the sort of inland South, like I was saying in part one, that stuff was still kind of considered exotic. It was kind of new. It had only been a part of the U.S. for a short time, and settlement had only recently begun. Anglo-American settlement had just recently begun. So what Bryant's doing is he's alluding to this kind of exotic, kind of different past. It's not an English colonial past. We're talking about French, a French word, a sort of French history, but also a Native American history. So as Bryant tries to historicize America, like Sedgwick, like Cooper, his contemporaries, like Child, he realizes that using, Native American history is almost a requirement if he's actually going to succeed in this project. But if you look around lines 40 and 45, you notice that he does this interesting move, because one thing that he noticed while visiting his brother out there were the large burial mounds, some of which still exist in places like Ohio and Kentucky. They were left behind by kind of the ancestors of the Native Americans who were still there, at this point in time. And the origins of some of those mounds are still kind of mysterious. We still don't know all about them or exactly who left them there, but most likely it was sort of, the predecessors of the tribes who were living there at first contact with Europeans. But Bryant is subscribing to this kind of mythical, almost certainly historically inaccurate version of the history of the mound builders. So you kind of get this right before line 45. He mentions the mighty mounds that overlook the rivers, or that rise in the dim forest crowded with old oaks. Then he mentions a race that long has passed away, built them, a disciplined and populous race. And then he kind of gets into this interesting comparison where he says that this forgotten, long-lost race built the burial mounds at a time when the ancient Greeks were still kind of primitive. Like the ancient Greeks had not quite established their civilization yet. So this kind of takes us back to Philip Freneau and a little bit of what we saw even going back to the beginning of the semester. This attempt to tap into an ancient Native American history, which was pretty foggy to most Europeans. And we kind of noted that Freneau is a little bit vague in general. He doesn't get into a lot of specifics. He just, and the Indian Burying Ground, that poem we read, I think in week 1 or week 2, he's at least aware that there is this older Native American history that Europeans don't really have access to. because it existed long before we arrived on the continent. So Bryant's kind of aware of that, and he's exploring that in his own way, but he's creating this kind of alternate history, this alternate race of people, because if you read on, he wants to differentiate this ancient race of mound builders from what he characterizes as the Red Man. So if you come down kind of between lines 55 and 60, he's sort of painting this very idyllic, very pastoral scene, right, of this beautiful ancient civilization, very elegant and graceful. They work the land, they build, remarkable edifices. He mentions the ample fields. They're playing instruments of unremembered form, speaking in a forgotten language. But then the Red Man came. The roaming hunter tribes, warlike and fierce, and the mound builders vanished from the earth. So that's probably not a very accurate account of what happened, but it's sort of this romanticized vision that Bryant wants as kind of part of American mythology, kind of a certain kind of understanding of American history that again puts me more in mind of Ralston and less in mind of Sedgwick. It's kind of similar to what Ralston's doing in the sense that here's kind of an idealized version of American history where the mound built, yes, there was an ancient race that got displaced, but notice whose fault it is, right? The ancient mound builders weren't displaced by anyone like Bryant. They were displaced by the Red Man, who's characterized as a hunter, as more nomadic, warlike, and fierce. So if you keep going, all the swarming cities, all the civilization of the mound builders is now gone. So we're kind of lamenting that. But then he pulls an interesting maneuver later around line 90 when he says the Red Man too has left the blooming wilds he ranged so long, and nearer to the Rocky Mountains sought a wider hunting ground. So he's sort of documenting progress, right? First, the mound builders get displaced by the Red Man, which is clearly a sort of inferior group in the eyes of Bryant, but he's aware that even those sort of contemporary Native Americans, as he understands them, are now being displaced by people like Bryant's brother, who are moving to the prairies of Illinois to establish homesteads, farms, towns, etc. So progress, westward expansion, like we've been talking about. But again, it's hard for Bryant to conceive or conceptualize of the possibility that the ancestors of the contemporary Red Man, that he doesn't seem to have a particularly high opinion of, it was probably the ancestors of that, the current Native Americans who built those mounds. It wasn't a totally different race with weird instruments and forgotten languages. It was just probably an older maybe a larger group or confederation of tribes that splintered, and then the offshoots became sort of more of the contemporary tribes that were encountered by Europeans. Something similar to that happened in the Southeast. We have early, documentation from conquistadors, Spanish explorers in Florida, who encountered a huge, powerful confederation that was probably based somewhere in modern-day Georgia or South Carolina. But by the time the English made contact in that same area, that large group had broken up into kind of splinter groups. But again, that larger sort of powerful confederation that the Spaniards met, those were probably the ancestors of modern-day Cherokees, Creeks, Choctaws, just like the mound builders were probably the ancestors of the Native Americans, like the Winnebago, the Kaskokea, the tribes in the upper Midwest that Bryant might have seen during his travels. So he's kind of fabricating the history, but he is trying to historicize the U.S., and he's staking a claim to sort of an ancient mythological past that can sort of rival the best of what you might find in Europe or other older parts, again, older being a relative term, but, other parts of the world. So he's invested in this same project that we've been talking about for the last few weeks. But again, he's romanticizing, he's sort of creating a fable, a sort of fantastical almost vision of the past, but he's inspired by the landscape. And again, this notion that there's a reason he changes that third line, because it was true. Not only was there not a word for prairie in the English language prior to the settlement, the Anglo settlement of the region, but the English settlers, when first confronted with this landscape, really didn't know what it was. They thought it was largely infertile. They mistook the absence of trees for a lack of fertility. They didn't know what the landscape was. They didn't have a precedent for it. They didn't have a vocabulary for it. They didn't have a previous experience with it. And again, Bryant's from the seaboard, so this is a different landscape than the forests and the mountains that people in the eastern U.S. would have been familiar with. This was a new place, a new landscape with a history and a mythology that seemed kind of rich and fascinating to American writers of this era. And Bryant's really sort of capturing that here. But again, notice the changes that he makes, and notice that he needs a different sort of parallel history, and kind of tease out the reasons he's doing that. Again, it might have a political purpose. It might be to remove some of the blame from Anglo settlers, and it might also be to cast contemporary Native Americans, as they were in the early 19th century, as maybe not as worthy as some ancient previous race that had left behind these mysterious mounds. So a lot of interesting stuff going on in this poem, but it definitely captures a mood, a way of thinking, a way of looking at this sort of new part of the U.S. So that's enough for Bryant. Let's just wrap up with Child. So she was born near Boston at kind of roughly the same time as a lot of these other figures. So again, we've really explored this second generation of American writers now, with Sedgwick, with Irving, Cooper, although we haven't read him, we have talked about him. Bryant was roughly the same age. Child was born maybe 6 or 7 years after Bryant. They're both from Massachusetts, but Child really did a lot of different stuff. So Bryant was an important literary figure. He was an editor, kind of like Charles Brockden Brown. He managed a lot of periodicals. He reviewed other people's work. He was kind of a preeminent early American poet. And we still read them. But Child did a lot of different types of writing. She wrote novels, she did short fiction, but she was also a pretty prolific writer of nonfiction. And she's actually credited by many as sort of being one of the first really modern journalists. She worked as the New York City correspondent for the Boston Courier in the 1840s. And she collected a bunch of, pieces, sort of short journalistic pieces that she wrote during that time, and the collection's called the Letters from New York, published in 2 separate volumes in 1843 and 1845. And we still read. That's a really interesting collection because it captures New York as it really kind of exploded into this major metropolis. But she also was very active in various reform movements, as I've already mentioned. So again, she was a champion for women's rights, the abolition of slavery, and Native American rights. She also published children's literature. She did a comparative study of religion that came out in the 1850s. She was writing all the way up through the end of the 1870s. She didn't die until 1880. So kind of like Bryant, again, they both lived a long time. They were prolific. They were continuing to write up through the later 19th century, but they made their mark really during this period, this sort of fertile period of the 1830s, as we're really on the brink now of sort of taking off as a national literature. So I just wanted you to read chapters 7 and 8 of Child's, an appeal in favor of that class of Americans called Africans. Kind of a mouthful. This came out in 1833. Obviously, it's not fiction, but I want you to notice some of the techniques and strategies that Child is using to do something similar, I think, to what Sedgwick was doing in Hope Leslie, essentially arguing for the basic humanity of African Americans. What Sedgwick was kind of doing for Native Americans and Hope Leslie, I think we can see Child doing here for African Americans. In chapter 7, arguing for the moral character of African Americans. So she's almost conceding the point early in the chapter that many, that's kind of a mainstream opinion, certainly held by most white people at the time, that African Americans were mentally inferior. But she's at least arguing that, more people could perhaps agree that there's not a significant moral defect, although that too was a popularly held notion. But she's pushing back against that again, similar to what we saw Sedgwick doing in her novel. But notice how Child does it here in a very sort of literary way, even though this is not literary fiction. She's using sort of extended anecdotes, like little narratives, episodes, drawn from first-hand accounts. She's pulling a lot of this stuff from other texts, travel literature, first-hand accounts. So she's capturing a lot of instances of brutality and cruelty, but she's also capturing instances where African Americans show their humanity. They show that they can feel and they have normal emotions and normal human responses just like other people. Kind of a strange reading experience in many ways for a modern audience, because of course Child is not telling us anything that we don't already know ourselves. But just remember the sort of political cause that she's taking up here. This is the early 1830s. She's writing in favor of abolition. She lives in a state where slavery had already been abolished, but notice how she's navigating the differences in cultures and regions. She's talking about the South and their reliance on slavery, and this notion that, well, maybe they'll end it one day when they're ready, that sort of open-ended quality. But she kind of makes an interesting rhetorical move at one point, saying that Northerners are sort of even have even less of an excuse, because while Southerners kind of rely on the institution economically and are sort of tied to it, she argues that Northerners who don't do enough to stop it are even worse in certain ways, because they don't have the same kind of cultural or economic dependency on it. But yet, many up north still supported it, or at least were not actively trying to end it. Of course, there were a lot of economic interests, a lot of the crops and sort of raw materials produced in the South by slave labor were later shipped to northern factories, where they became commodities, a huge part of the U.S. economy. So, Child sort of calling a lot of that out in terms that not a ton of other writers were really using at this point in time. So Child really sort of acquired a reputation as kind of a firebrand, a political writer, somebody that was willing to sort of draw attention to the great shame of the country, the institution of slavery, which a lot of polite writers, people like Sedgwick, would have just preferred to not talk about. At least in their sort of public-facing lives, in terms of their fiction or in terms of the writing that they were producing. It wasn't a topic that many people really wanted to tackle. It was messy. It was obviously highly controversial. And we know what would eventually happen in the decades to come. But Child, to me, she's just a really sort of accurate, precise, sort of biting commentator. In some ways, she just has a sort of a clarity to her prose that I think still comes through even today. There's a real sort of energy and a directness that, again, I think stood out in the 1830s. It wasn't typical of what a lot of other people were doing. And then in chapter 8, sort of a different approach. She's looking at prejudices against people of color and our duties in relation to this subject. So again, more extended examples. It's a very literary style. She's taking episodes, scenes, talking about individuals, kind of giving us individual characters and little small self-contained narratives to illustrate her points. So you can see that she's a literary writer, she's using those techniques. She can really paint a scene. If you were in 451, you read a little bit of Letters from New York. We're not going to get to that text in here because it comes a little later. But yeah, she has some real powers of observation that, again, helped her to kind of create modern journalism. But also, that same quality shows up in her fiction and a lot of her other nonfiction as well. Okay, so I think that's it for all of the texts. Make it your goal to get through that whole group that I posted last week. Get through all of that by the end of this week. And also get moving on the proposal and the critical summary. Let me know if you have any questions about that assignment. Obviously, we can talk more about it. And if you want to talk about the final paper, that's fine too. Next week, my lecture will be about the final paper and the final exam. That's all I will talk about. There will be no discussion of texts. So make sure you catch up, and then we'll conclude next week.